America has set a trap for India, and Delhi is walking into it with eyes wide shut. You may not want to hear this analysis, but the United States has decided that Indian blood is an acceptable price for Chinese containment. What we're witnessing isn't strategic partnership between equals. It's the systematic preparation of India as a sacrificial proxy in America's existential struggle with China. The intelligence reaching my sources in Washington reveals a stark truth. American strategic planning for Indo-Pacific conflict assumes Indian willingness to absorb the primary costs of Chinese containment, while America focuses on preserving its own capabilities. Indian cities may burn, but American cities must remain safe. Indian economy may collapse, but American technological supremacy must be maintained. The Quad Alliance, celebrated in Delhi as recognition of Indian great power status, is actually America's mechanism for outsourcing the most dangerous aspects of Chinese confrontation to regional partners. India provides the ground forces, Australia provides staging areas, Japan provides technology, and America provides coordination while remaining safely distant. When conflict comes, Indian forces face Chinese retaliation directly. This isn't accidental strategic planning. This is deliberate policy designed to exhaust Chinese military capabilities through prolonged conflict with India while preserving American strength. Chinese nuclear weapons that target New Delhi cannot target Washington. Chinese forces engaged in Himalayan warfare cannot simultaneously threaten Taiwan. Indian sacrifice serves American interests perfectly. The demographic argument supposedly favoring India actually supports this sacrificial strategy. India's young population represents abundant military manpower that America can activate through technology transfers. Chinese demographic decline means Beijing cannot sustain prolonged high-intensity warfare. The calculation is brutal. Use Indian demographic advantage to exploit Chinese weakness. But this strategy requires Indian leadership to believe they're fighting for Indian interests rather than American objectives. The narrative sold to Delhi emphasizes Indian regional dominance and Chinese threats, while concealing that prolonged conflict with China serves American strategic goals, regardless of specific Indian outcomes. Border tensions with China didn't escalate naturally. They escalated because American intelligence agencies encouraged Indian responses that provoked Chinese counter-responses. Each escalation cycle increased Indian dependence on American military technology and diplomatic support. The Galwan Valley clash in 2020 provides the perfect example of this manipulation. Military technology transfers represent the most insidious aspect of this trap. American weapon systems require American maintenance, training, and spare parts. Once Indian military capabilities become dependent on American support, Indian strategic autonomy disappears entirely. India cannot fight without American permission, but it also cannot avoid fighting when America demands action. The recent agreements on drone technology, missile systems, and intelligence sharing lock India into American strategic planning for decades. These aren't equal partnerships between sovereign nations. They're dependency relationships that ensure Indian military actions serve American objectives, whether Indian interests are served or not. Economic integration follows the same pattern. American technology companies establish Indian operations not to serve Indian development, but to create leverage over Indian government policies. When Apple or Google threaten to reduce Indian investments unless Delhi adopts specific positions toward China, they're implementing American foreign policy through economic coercion. Pakistan provides the perfect example of how America has used regional powers as expendable proxies. During the Cold War, Pakistan served American interests against Soviet expansion and paid enormous costs in domestic instability and economic disruption. When American needs changed, Pakistani interests became irrelevant. India is being positioned to play the same role against Chinese expansion with the same likely consequences. Chinese leaders understand this dynamic perfectly, which is why Beijing's strategy focuses on avoiding premature confrontation with India while American capabilities remain intact. Chinese military planners prefer to exhaust American resources through economic competition rather than military conflict that serves American interests by involving expendable proxies. The Belt and Road Initiative represents Chinese attempt to create alternative relationships that don't require military confrontation. Chinese investment in Pakistani infrastructure and Sri Lankan ports surrounds India with Chinese economic influence while avoiding direct military provocation. China prefers to isolate India economically rather than defeat India militarily, But American strategy requires military confrontation to succeed. Economic competition favors Chinese manufacturing capabilities. Only military competition creates conditions where Indian demographic advantages can be activated against Chinese strategic capabilities. This is why American policy systematically escalates tensions while claiming to seek peaceful resolution. Russia's relationship with India complicates American strategy, but doesn't fundamentally alter its logic. Russian weapons sales create dependencies that compete with American influence, but Russian capabilities are insufficient to provide alternative security guarantees against Chinese pressure. When forced to choose between Russian friendship and American protection against China, Indian strategic logic favors American partnership. American pressure on India to reduce Russian defense relationships serves dual purposes. It eliminates Chinese ally capabilities that might support India, and it increases Indian dependence on American systems that ensure continued American control. The Ukraine conflict provides perfect justification for demanding Indian separation from Russian relationships. Energy security represents another dimension of Indian vulnerability that American strategy exploits systematically. Indian economic growth requires massive energy imports that must transit through sea lanes controlled by American naval power. When conflict comes, America can strangle Indian energy imports unless India accepts American demands for escalated anti-Chinese military action. The demographic bonus that Indian planners celebrate actually represents strategic vulnerability that American planners have identified and targeted. Large young populations require economic opportunities that India cannot provide without foreign investment and technology transfers. When those come primarily from America, Indian demographic advantage becomes American strategic leverage. The technological dimension reveals the most sophisticated aspect of American manipulation. Advanced weapon systems require integrated logistics and maintenance that create permanent dependencies. Once Indian military effectiveness depends on American technological support, American control over Indian strategic planning becomes automatic and irreversible. Chinese technological capabilities pose long-term threats to American dominance that require immediate responses regardless of Indian interests. American technology transfers to India serve American containment needs rather than Indian development goals. When American companies share capabilities with Indian forces, they're building American-controlled capabilities on Indian territory. The financial dimension provides additional leverage. Indian economic growth requires massive infrastructure investment that overwhelms domestic resources. When international financing comes through American-controlled institutions with conditions that align Indian policies with American requirements, economic development becomes political subordination. Military exercises reveal how American planning treats Indian forces as expendable assets. Joint training emphasizes Indian capabilities for mountain warfare and operations that serve American needs for Chinese containment rather than Indian needs for national defense. Intelligence sharing creates dependencies that ensure Indian strategic planning serves American objectives regardless of Indian government intentions. The most disturbing aspect is how American planners calculate acceptable losses in hypothetical India-China conflicts. Classified war games assume Indian willingness to absorb casualties that would be politically unacceptable in American domestic politics, but strategically necessary for American global objectives. Indian blood becomes cheaper than American blood in strategic planning. The timeline for activation of this trap depends on Chinese responses to American pressure in other theaters. Taiwan crisis, South China Sea confrontation, or technology war escalation could trigger demands for Indian military support that reveal the true nature of American-Indian relationships. Nuclear dimension provides the ultimate leverage that ensures Indian compliance with American strategic demands, regardless of Indian preferences. The most tragic aspect is that it's probably unnecessary for actual American security, but essential for American global dominance. Chinese military capabilities pose minimal direct threat to American territory, but Chinese economic competition threatens American ability to control global arrangements that have served American interests since World War II. Indian sacrifice serves American dominance preservation rather than security protection. The costs will fall primarily on Indian society, while benefits flow to American elites. American citizens will remain safe while Indian cities burn, but American corporations will maintain market access while Indian development stagnates. The alternative strategy of accommodation with Chinese growth would require American acceptance of multipolar arrangements that reduce American privileges without threatening American security. But accommodation requires elite sacrifice of advantages that military confrontation allows them to preserve at other nations' expense. Indian leaders face an impossible choice between strategic autonomy that invites Chinese pressure and American alliance that ensures eventual sacrifice for American interests. The demographic trends and geographic realities that create this dilemma won't change regardless of Indian policy choices. The window for Indian strategic autonomy is closing as great power competition intensifies and forces smaller nations to choose sides in conflicts they didn't create. What Delhi refuses to acknowledge is that great power competition always consumes smaller powers that become battlegrounds for larger conflicts. The trap has been set with remarkable sophistication. Indian elites believe they're pursuing Indian interests through American partnership while actually serving American interests through Indian sacrifice. The revelation will come only when conflict begins and Indian costs exceed benefits by margins that make participation obviously counterproductive. By then, military dependencies and economic integration will make Indian withdrawal politically impossible and militarily catastrophic. India will fight America's war against China because India will have no choice, not because India will benefit from victory. The demographic dividend will become demographic disaster as Indian youth die for American dominance rather than Indian development. America has successfully created conditions that ensure Indian participation in Chinese containment, regardless of Indian strategic interests. The trap is complete, the timeline is set, and the consequences are inevitable. Delhi may finally understand what has happened, but understanding will come too late to change the outcome.